And so that means that our teachers need to be habituating right action, and they need to be teaching true and good and beautiful and good content.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm seated with Paul and Tanya and an old friend, kind of, Mitchell Holly. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about virtue formation in the classroom and virtue formation in classical education more broadly. But before we get there, Paul, you finished Persuasion.
I did finish Persuasion.
And I missed the group. I missed the group
discussion.
meeting. Yes, because I had a tooth pulled.
Oh,
So I totally missed fighting with Paul about Persuasion.
Oh, no. Well, let's do it now. I'd like to see the fight.
So
Can you give me what's that? Can you give me a summary of the fight?
if I actually came down on the side that I could get fully on board with Persuasion if I can read it as a critique of a society that does not allow people to communicate properly.
That is exactly it.
But so some of the people at the table were okay with that statement. Some people weren't.
Oh, so that's fun.
But I was like, if I have to read this as, ooh, this is all hunky dory and this is wonderful and this is a great like love story. No, that is an abysmal love story.
I think Jane Austen was smarter than that. I think she knew the plight of the woman. And that's what, don't you think?
I completely agree. And Martin has fought us on this every time, but he's not here to defend himself.
That's right.
But every time we brought this up, he's been like, I don't think so. But I completely agree with you. I think she is tongue firmly planted in cheek through all of her writing.
I do too.
And then I can get fully on board with that. But it was so infuriating for Anne.
Right.
It was, and it was funny because in the discussion, you would have loved this, but early on people were like, oh no, that was just the culture that, you just didn't do that kind of thing. You wouldn't just say what you felt. And then I read a paragraph right after the opera or the performance they go to, where she realizes that Wentworth is jealous of
Oh, yeah.
Elliot, Mr. Elliot.
Yeah, Mr. Elliot.
And there's this whole paragraph about how is she going to tell him? How could she ever communicate to him that that she loves him? I'm like, just tell him. And people, after I read it, was that sort of like that, that
satirical.
tone,
Uh-huh.
they were like, oh, now we see it. I'm like, if I can read it that way, then I'm on board.
Yeah.
Tanya, what about you? What have you been reading now that you finished Persuasion? Did you read Persuasion? You read
I
it.
did read.
Yeah,
I did reread it. I'm reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn after our podcast with Carol, and she said that was what she was reading, and I said I read it as a teenager, and I was kind of shocked that she was reading it and in a women's book group.
Yeah.
And so she convinced me that it's really a book for adults. And so I started it again, and when I first started it, I was like, this still is just like a coming of age novel. Mm-hmm. But then the more I read, it's really about poverty. It's really a book about poverty. And it's fascinating to me. It's just the life of this little girl, like from 11 to college, I guess, pulling herself out of the poverty that she lives in Brooklyn in 1912 is the beginning of the book. So the stories about what her mother can do with a stale loaf of bread and make that last and make different meals of it for a week. They're just fascinating stories and things that I wouldn't as a teenager have really been focused on at all. I was really more focused on my life paralleling this little girl
Sure.
and all the teenage things that are going to go on. But it's really like a Grapes of Wrath as far as the plight of poverty. I'm not comparing this at all with Steinbeck.
Right.
But as far as thematically, it deals with poverty in a way that is just heart-wrenching, but also shows the pride.
Resilience, maybe. Yeah.
Pride, resilience, and goodness of just trying to carve a life out with very little opportunity for change.
Yeah.
Speaking of Steinbeck, Tanya, I'm totally in on East of Eden, and I'd like to request not to come into work tomorrow and just listen to the book the whole day because I am all in on this book. It is so good.
It's on my list of things for my kids to get me for Mother's Day. I always have to send them a book list. I send them a book list.
It's not exactly the Mother's Day present.
East of Eden.
Yeah, it's a little bit gritty.
It's always they always get me a book.
I was going to say that it seems like a mark of great children or young adult literature maybe is it's the kind of literature that when you read it as a kid, you resonate with the kid's perspective. And then when you read it as an adult, you resonate with the adult's perspective. I mean, I feel like that is a sign of a powerful piece of work that's targeting kind of young adult children.
Yes.
I've still reading the Iliad, book 14, 15. I also, though, I went to nonfiction. Tanya, I apologize.
That's okay.
And I picked up Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And it's about 120 pages, and it's an exploration of the Genesis 22 story where Abraham sacrifices Isaac. And he says, I can't comprehend why Abraham does this. And what he can't comprehend is faith. And that's the whole thing. It's just the exploration of what is faith and its paradox. And so I read that on the plane last week when I was traveling, and it's really, really good, really interesting.
I am glad that you enjoy those kinds of things. But I will have to admit, I'm reading From Plato to Christ, which I think is very well written for somebody like me who really just needs an introduction to philosophy. But I honestly cannot say that I enjoy discussing, talking about, reading about what is justice? What is injustice? How, what are is this unjust? Does this make
virtue?
this?
Do you like talking about virtue?
That's
we can't do the segue yet.
Virtue may be a problem too. But I just don't enjoy it. And so this sounds fascinating to me, this Kierkegaard book. But at the same time, I think if I were reading it, would I really, I don't know why Tanya, I don't enjoy it.
When I was teaching literature, one of the things I thought I was trying to do was provide avenues for enjoyment. That is, I think a lot of my students had a preconceived notion of what they found enjoyable. And I was trying to put structures in their mind.
That's right.
Help them to find other things enjoyable.
I think
but I won't do that for you.
We all try to do that though.
Yeah.
We want them to enjoy it,
Right.
that we want them to enjoy the things we enjoy. And I'm trying to enjoy it. It's not happening. In fact, I've got the book and the audio book.
Oh.
So I'm listening to it and then I go back to the book and
That's funny. Yeah.
It's just
I
not for
still
you.
don't enjoy it. I just don't think philosophy's for me. So I'm going to probably cut out right now and let you all talk about virtue.
Well, modern philosophy probably, because modern philosophy it's not really, it's sort of very abstract. It's not very personal, but like classical philosophy is like very intimate. I mean, it's very...
So Plato's classical.
True, yeah.
Okay, not enjoying it.
Well,
But you're reading a modern explanation of what Plato says.
You're not actually reading a
Plato
dialogue.
himself.
Do you think if I read Plato, it would be
Actually,
more
yeah,
enjoyable?
absolutely.
It'd be better.
You should do Paul Scores.
Mitchell, what are you reading?
Let me come in on those videos.
You may have to. I'm having trouble getting people to show up.
Let the man speak.
Oh, sorry.
Three
What's your name
things.
again?
The man. Three things. One, I'm in the middle of a Graham Greene novel that Paul gave me, and I don't want to talk about it here because I want to talk about it with Paul whenever I'm done, and I'm afraid that
It's bad radio.
Well, he loves it so much that he's gonna. I don't want Paul in my mind when I'm reading.
We do need to get to virtue
is
at some point.
It's the end of it.
I'm not even telling you.
I gave him two. I gave him that one.
He
and a
gave me
burnt out
two.
case.
So that, and then as I'm able, I'm working through the Greek text of Winnie the Pooh. There's a classics guy in
Show off.
I believe you were reading Winnie the Pooh the last time that you were on this.
In English,
on
but
this
now I'm working
podcast,
through it
which
in
was like a
Greek.
year ago.
Yeah,
So
right.
you've been reading Winnie the Pooh for a year.
I'm a really
you're saying.
big Winnie the Pooh fan. I'm,
You know what, though? Those translations of children's books are hard.
They're very
not
difficult.
So
yeah.
you think, your child's taking Latin. So you think, oh, let's get the hat in Latin or green eggs and ham in
No.
Latin or Harry Potter in Latin. And
Yeah.
it's hard.
Yeah, I've translated a few for Sylvia, and and they're not easy. I mean, just the
From
vocabulary
English to Greek.
from English to Greek, and they're pretty difficult. And so, she'll have to read them later. So Winnie the Pooh, that's the second one, but sort of just as I'm able, I'm really going very slow. And then we've been talking about your Kierkegaard reading. And Kierkegaard has been a huge influence on me. So it's sort of excited. I've been excited as you've been walking through it. So I picked up Fear and Trembling and just going back and looking at my highlights. And I'm going to start again. My hope is to start in the next day or two. But just because that was such an influential book for me. So yeah, shout out to Kierkegaard.
I don't think he's listening.
Well, so these are two total opposite reactions to your reading of Kierkegaard. So just embrace Mitchell.
Yeah, I'll try.
He's never been that way to me.
Let's transition to our topic. And the topic for today is virtue formation. Now, the reason this topic is apropos for us, and I should say that the U.S. history topic, virtue formation, I don't know if directly these topics were suggested to me by a listener, but Ben Shinneberry,
Yes.
who's, I believe, the husband of Angela, who works here, sent me a really nice email with several suggestions. And I think both of those were on there, although we've get suggestions from other people too. So thank you for listening and emailing. But virtue is apropos for us because we say in our mission statement that classical education instills virtue. So I think it's worth talking about how it does that. And does it happen in a homeschool classical education, an online academy in a classroom? So Mitch, let me kick it to you first. Principal of the online academy. It's your students are in a disembodied space looking at screens.
It hurts. Yeah, it hurts when you say that. But
How does classical education instill virtue?
Can I interrupt?
Mhm.
Can I take this in a different direction? Can we define virtue first?
Let's do it.
That sounds like a very
get definitions
philosophical
first.
question.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Tanya,
Okay.
this is just a new moment for you.
Yeah.
Is it?
Embracing
Because
philosophy.
it doesn't feel philosophical to me. It feels like something you could look up in the dictionary.
No, but
Well-
but that's what philosophy is asking definitions.
A way to ask this question would be, I think for a lot of people, it's been fruitful to see how the word virtue is used in the classical period. And that's a part of kind of what sparked this classical education movement. Paul, where do you think the word virtue means?
Oh,
And do you
okay, good.
think that what it means today, contrasted with what it used to mean, is helpful for us to think about?
Okay, number one, the definition of virtue, I believe I'm going to Aristotelian. Maybe this is Thomistic. I don't know. A habitual disposition to do the good. Okay, that's what virtue is. A habitual disposition to do the good. So, but I think you're referring to virtue coming from the word virtus, which means like strength or courage, and the etymological root.
Well,
to
I think
it.
a lot of people noticing that, the word that we translate in Greek, arete, as excellence, but also virtue, is helpful to think about that, a habitual disposition towards the good. It's an excellence in particular habits. Whereas in the modern days, a lot of times virtue is just a good thing anyone does. It's hard to put your finger on excellence or habitual disposition towards the good.
Or habituation towards excellence might be like an excellence of something. So something is virtuous. So an excellent knife, according to Aristotle, a virtuous knife is a knife that cuts well. It's because in one of its virtue is its sharpness.
So therefore, in the domain of humanity, right, virtue therefore is this habituation of that human being driven towards what it means for a human to be excellent.
Yes, that's right.
Which would be morality.
Well, that's the
Living
moral
in truth, beauty, and goodness, maybe.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
So but Augustine, I asked for the definition because Augustine, what did he say? The right order of things?
Mm.
Okay, so that would be, what is that? The love of God first?
Yeah, so I think he was centering on the way that human beings actually act, is that usually they have a disposition towards or a love of a certain thing. And so that habitual disposition towards the good is actually speaking towards our affections. And Augustine is like the first person to really clearly articulate that it's the things that we like and love that cause us to act. And so we have to like and love the right things.
Okay, so the right things would be God, family,
Goodness, truth, beauty.
goodness, truth, beauty. Okay.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
opposed
I'm
to
clear.
elevating pleasure.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
make sure I knew what
and that's
you
important
all mean by
because
virtue.
right, like virtue has to serve some end. Like, why is virtue even important? Well, we consider virtue important because it is striving towards some goal, some good that we think is important. And so then the question is, what is that goal? And that's the first where Aristotle starts. What is the highest good that we're trying to achieve? And the highest good, we could define it as pleasure, which we probably wouldn't want to do.
Right.
You can define it as
happiness.
which is how Aristotle sort of lands.
But Plato would give a different understanding of the good.
Sure. But again, virtue and virtue formation is serving some purpose, some function, it's helping us move towards some direction. Otherwise, why be? It answers the question, why be virtuous?
Which C.S. Lewis deals with, right, in Mere Christianity.
Right. And that's why it's important to answer that question, and that relates to education. Why be virtuous? Why be educated? For what good are you trying to serve or pursue as a result of being virtuous or being educated?
Before we move into the practical, because you're kind of bumping up into it, and I want to get there, come back around to the first question, but do you agree with me, in my double question to Paul, do you agree that the modern kind of just average person's sense of the word virtue is different than what we just described as the definition of virtue?
What do you think the modern person thinks virtue is?
I think that most people think of virtue as merely ethical right action.
Morality.
As morality. Strictly. Not to say that it doesn't touch on morality, but I think by thinking about kind of the past, you bring up some other important distinctions. Like, is it excellence in a tradition that's maybe not even moral? Like to work really hard in a test, is that virtuous?
To work hard.
It's not necessarily morally right or wrong. I mean, depending on how you frame it, but that broadens our understanding of this category. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I think that virtue does become, just like everything else, the more you know about the past and its meaning in the past, the richer your understanding of it is. And I think that is classical education, right?
Well, and after the Enlightenment, moral philosophers after the Enlightenment did not talk about virtue in the same way. And so, like for Aristotle and for the classical authors, being happy is a moral question. Are you happy? Are you doing the things that will make you happy?
But happiness not defined in our modern sense of happiness.
That's right. The word that he sort of is eudaimonia, which is sort of flourishing, human flourishing.
A blessedness.
Blessedness. Yeah. Right. So that you're absolutely right. Thanks for the footnote. But that just aside for a second, modern moral philosophy doesn't see like your pursuit of happiness as a moral question. They say, morality is relegated not to if you're happy or not, but do you do the right things? And so modern moral philosophy is just sort of is just a science of decision making. How do you do the right things in situation X at time T
Right.
For person P? Should he do 1 or 2? And then if you choose one at the right time in the right situation with the right person, then boom, you've done a moral act. And so questions of are you virtuous? Are you happy? Are you blessed? Are you trying to work towards human flourishing? Modern philosophers don't really consider that an ethical issue of are you being morally right or wrong?
Because also they're denying human nature and human nature having a telos, a purpose.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that's why modern moral philosophers would not go into that question, because they say we don't have an unchanging nature that we all share.
Absolutely. And that's why it's always important, I think, when you're talking about virtue, is to first start by talking about the telos. What is the human?
And by telos, you mean the end, the purpose.
What is the purpose?
Goal.
What is the function? What is the goal of human qua human, as a human. And then when you answer that question, then you can say what dispositions of the soul, as you define virtue, are getting us there or not getting us there. If the end or goal of a knife is to cut, well, if it's dull, then it's not going to reach its purpose, right? So anyway.
So we've described it kind of in the abstract on a definitional level, which has been really helpful. Let's get into the classroom. Back to you, Mitch. Online Academy. Are you able to help them become sharp knives in the online space? Like, how do you help them to develop excellencies in this environment?
Yeah, I would say that when Aristotle talked about, for me, and when I'm talking about teachers, to teachers and to students, I sort of take the Aristotle route here, and I say that there are two areas of virtue. There are intellectual virtues, so virtues of thinking, and there are virtues of action. Virtues of action have to be habituated; they have to be practiced. Virtues of intellect have to be taught. And education does both of those things. It forms, for students, it forms habits and it teaches. And so that means that our teachers need to be habituating right action, and they need to be teaching true and good and beautiful and good content. And when you're in a Latin class, you must hold they don't want to study vocabularies every day, but they have to build that habit. By building that habit, you're building virtues. You're like faithfulness, like consistency, like even courage to stand up to a friend that wants to invite you out, but you haven't done your vocabulary cards. So you say, hey, if I'm going to be like a good student, then I have to say no to that. I've got to have courage to stand up to my friend. So you're cultivating habits in your students just by assigning them homework and holding them accountable to it. But then hopefully you're also accompanying that with a content-rich education, those intellectual virtues of which Aristotle defines as sort of knowledge of unchanging things, knowledge of craftiness, art, knowledge of just practically the different ways that you can live in the world, right? So, and that comes through history and philosophy. So anyway, I try to always tell teachers and tell families and parents, we're deeply concerned about habits, and we're deeply concerned about teaching them content. But these two things go hand in hand. So
you could go back to the definition that Paul gave, a habitual disposition towards the good, a habitual disposition that's taught towards the good, the content, and it's brought together. Yeah. What else would you add, Paul, to how virtue is brought out in the classroom?
There's all these intellectual virtues that are being formed. And Mitch brought up the faithfulness and consistency and like what we require of them. But there's also, how do you treat one another in the classroom, right? How do you respect a teacher? I remember trying to help a family out with a couple of kids that, in like a righteous repulsion towards some of the wrong action that was being taught in literature, right? Or that characters were doing in literature. And they were so appalled by that they were actually being disrespectful to the teacher about like, why are we reading this? This is inappropriate, right? And so it was very interesting walking with the parents and the children, like, okay, and the parents were on board. Like, we want them learning this stuff, but we understand that they've gone way too far in the way that they've treated their teacher. And so it's okay, now let's have a conversation about what is right action, not theoretically look like, but in your classroom dealing with the people around you. And this is just online, right? And the thing is, online, there is much less inhibition towards typing something that you would never say.
That's true.
Right? And so it actually, in some ways, gives us a more transparent look at what's going on in these children's heads.
Yeah.
Than what
no
it
filter.
would be.
More than you want to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's all of that happens as well. In sort of, as we have to watch classroom, and the teachers will daily be pointing out to students like that. We're not doing that here today. That's not appropriate to say to your fellow classmate, that sort of thing. All sort of like low level things, and then as it gets to a bigger level, it escalates stuff.
The teacher is sort of like a midwife for the soul, because they're sort of they're not only trying to instantiate in the student or bring to life in the student, like study habits and virtues that are going to help them be a good student, but also interpersonally, right?
How to be a good person.
Yeah, how to be a good person. The other example that I think is funny, sometimes I get calls, from family, my kid just doesn't want to engage. Like, I'm hopeful that he can learn the material, but like, he's just not going to put the time in that this class needs. So can we just focus on helping him learn the material? And I say, that's impossible. If your student is not willing to engage in these habits, like set aside a few minutes to study his vocabulary cards, his growth in virtue is going to be concomitant with his growth in knowledge. And so if he's unwilling to do the habits, then he will not learn. and that's where, like, we can put him in a situation, but he may not learn.
You're scaring me.
Well, but I mean, really what you're doing is you're telling the parent you're forming a habitual disposition not to do the good.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
by putting them in a position where you're asking them to learn this content, but not giving them the habits with which to be successful.
It's an incomplete definition of virtue. It's to define virtue as the good rather than a habitual disposition towards the good.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Tony, what would you add in the non-fragmented online space? How does education?
I feel like we keep getting undermined here.
Bring
We are
about
reluctantly
virtue.
online.
Yeah.
At homeschools or in regular schools?
I mean, I am going back to Augustine.
Yeah.
You're so philosophical today.
Wow.
Where did I read that, do you think?
Lewis mentions
Marcus.
in the abolition of man.
I haven't read the Abolition of Man, but it's on
reading
my
Marcus?
list.
It might have been in Plato to Christ, from Plato to Christ.
Maybe.
I
I
quoted
don't-
that section in an article I wrote for Memoria Press.
I
So
bet that's
you may
where
have
it
just
was. Of course, I read your articles every night before I go to
Tanya.
bed. It could be, but I do think, what are we leading our students toward? Their purpose in life, serving God that is the ultimate. And all of these things that we're talking about are getting us there. So we just can't lose sight of that.
right.
I think it's harder in the online school. When you've got a classroom of students who are with one teacher, they have to learn to get along and to treat each other well. I can't imagine trying to do that with everybody in a different home just on a screen. I think
there's some unique challenges for sure.
Yes, it's
and
definitely different.
yeah. And I will say the average family for us, it's definitely a partnership with families.
Right.
So we're more of a cottage school model, and students are successful to the extent that their parents are engaged in that partnership. Because they may come to class 1 or 2 days a week with us.
Right.
But then the rest of the week they're at home and they're being supervised by their parents, and the parents are making sure that students have set aside time to study, to take the assessments. And for the average student, that partnership is strong.
Yes.
But any school, there's.
But that's true in the brick and mortar school too, is that you have to be getting the same thing at home that you're getting at school. You can't have it's not fair to have that contradictory experience for students. They need the consistency of these are our rules. This is our code of conduct at school, and we need you to respect that at home too.
Right.
Or you're not going to it is going to be totally lopsided. And students will learn that rather than being good because that's the moral right thing to do and it's building their character, they'll learn that, well, I have to follow the rules here, but it's a different set of rules there. So is it really an important rule? Is it really a rule, or is it just some hoop I have to jump through? Because we're trying to train children to become good citizens and good adults, good people doing what God wants them to do with their lives. And so I think virtue's huge. And it really is at the center of everything else, right? Is there anything that we're teaching that's more important than that?
I don't think so.
And I love the way that you connected it with actually their academic growth too. I thought that separation and then bringing it together was very strong.
Wow. Good job, Mitch.
Thanks.
So a question that has arisen from this discussion, Mitch brought up the hypothetical of a parent having to coach a student or a teacher having to coach a student when they have a friend asked them to come hang out, and instead they need to be doing their work. Well, somebody could counter and say, how do I decide what the right virtue is, right? Is it more important to study on this quiz, or should I be a good friend? How do we help our students in classical education to decide between the varying competing virtues that are being advocated for them? How do they know what is actually virtue and which affection should be the greatest, and how they order these affections?
Aristotle says it's impossible for kids to know this because they haven't lived, they don't have enough experience. They haven't acquired enough wisdom in the world.
So we have to do it. We have to do it for them.
But we're also presenting them as, we're trying to give them as much experience as we can through literature and history.
Absolutely.
But also, I mean, I was going to reference Plato, not Aristotle. I mean, Plato, in his presentation of the good is something that you behold in a way that is intangible, right? I mean, it's the whole reincarnation thing, and you've seen this before you were born, but it is very much, even like Plato presents it very much as even like it's hard for an adult to discern what is good, because that good is, as a Christian Platonist, you would say, well, the good is God, and there's not a way to like make that very concrete for the child to understand what that habitual disposition towards the good is.
Well, and the child's not going to be able to discern the fact that, I want to be a good friend to my friend, but my friend would want me, if my friend is a good friend, they would obviously want me to do well on my quiz and not put me in that position. I mean, it's complicated. We do have to do a lot of it for them, but we also have to, they've got to learn those things, but we have to tell them.
It's helpful to remember, and Aristotle makes the point that ethics is not an exact science. It's not like knowledge of unchangeable things like math, like 2 + 2 = 4. That's a very clear formula. We know exactly 2 + 2 will always equal 4. Knowing to go hang out with the friend or not to go out to friend is not an exact science, because sometimes it may be necessary for you to forgo what you were going to do, like when your friend is going through a hard time, for example, right? And so knowledge, ethical knowledge or virtue knowledge, is knowledge of changing things. And it depends upon the person in that situation, and is there fittedness to the time. And we acquire that knowledge through experience, through reading literature, through seeing stories about people and how they were friends, and balancing these sort of responsibilities by observing parents and seeing them negotiate these values in the context of their own lives, right? So I think whenever students are young, you tell them, hey, this is not friend time. This is study time. So you're telling them, but then as they get older, you're probably, I don't have a student that is old enough. My child is 2 years old. But I imagine at a certain point, I want to sort of invite her to start making that choice, giving her the responsibilities, and then inviting her to make that choice. But for a long time, it's probably just me discerning for her what are the right virtues at what time.
But you also have to watch their habitual dispositions, right? So you have child A and child B, and child A would be the kind of kid that's going to sit there and do his flashcards all day long, right? So he's mastered that virtue of diligence, and child B is the kind of kid that's going to leave that and go play with their friends. And so when you're trying to when both of them want to go play with their friends, well, you may tell child A, you get to go play with your friends, and child B, you get to do your flashcards because you've identified what their habitual disposition is, and you're trying to help them grow that habitual disposition to what it needs to be.
Because that kid who's diligent, if he's diligent all the time, and then he never goes and plays with the friend, at a certain point, that's not a virtue anymore, and it's now in excess.
Yeah, and he may not want to go play with friends. You need to say, you need to go play with your friends.
You need to go do that. That's
you all are so excited about this, but I feel
we
like
want to go play with our friends.
Oh, is that what it is? Like, let's just end this thing so you can go play. I feel like you just keep doing Aristotle, you keep doing Plato. Do you feel like we're in the middle of some kind
of? I do kind of feel like there's a tension here.
Yes, I think so.
There's no tension between Plato and Aristotle. They are,
there is a tension.
One is the student, one is the teacher. Paul is the teacher, and I am the student.
Wow. So moving on from your
That's really quaint. I don't know.
fundamental
It's nothing.
disagreements. I do want to ask you about the role of story, especially in classical education, and how we connect that to virtue. It seems like we spend a lot of time telling our students stories. How do you think that plays a part in virtue formation, and how so?
Well, Paul alluded to it. I mean, like when you read stories, did you want to?
No, go for it. Just tell them what I was alluding to.
You alluded to it earlier about the importance that stories sort of inoculate you into the world by giving you little doses of truly human experiences, so that you can learn how difficult it is. So you see stories of characters choosing between playing with their friends, staying at home. You see stories of fathers choosing when to go to war and when they need to go home. Right, that's what you're reading about, and why it's necessary, for that to even happen. So you see characters themselves embodying these virtues in different times, different situations, and the more you can see examples of real humans in real life situations at particular moments choosing one path versus another, that sort of becomes a scientific way of understanding of studying humans and this type of decisions and attitudes that you may be invited into because of your life situations, right? And how you should then live. And so it becomes a sort of eye into the glimpse of the human spirit and how you should then live, right? They become models or paradigms to avoid.
I can't remember. I wish I could remember the context, but I was in a classroom yesterday and they were reviewing for a Greek myths test. And so she was going through, the stories that they had just done. And I don't remember the context, but whatever the story was in Greek myths, a student brought up a biblical story that kind of paralleled it and asked about it. And so she talked about the biblical story. And then she said, and remember, this other's just a myth. And then she moved on. But it was the same lesson, once with actual humanity and once with fantastical creatures. But the student was able to make the parallel between them.
They were able to pull out the moral instruction in that story.
And connect it to the biblical story.
Yeah.
It would be a lot stronger if I could remember the story.
I would say, when it comes to virtue and story, what was occurring to me is that when I'm talking to like a close friend about, whatever, when I'm kind of telling my deepest, darkest, intimate thoughts, or whatever, when I'd like to, where am I today? So when Mitchell and I spend time together, I constantly am using stories to say, that's the kind of person I want to be like, or that is what that person struggled with in that story is what I'm struggling with right now. And it's a way for me to actually express sort of feelings, emotions that it would take me a long time to formulate words that would really fully encapsulate it. But if they read the same stories I have, I'm able to actually communicate it. And so,
Jesus chose that.
Right. And so insofar as being able to then use those, if we're instructing students to say, well, what did Heidi do in the book? I was, we were talking about the death of my cat this morning, and somehow we got to the prolapse of the soul. And so I started thinking about Anna Karenina and the choices she makes, and it ends up, being her final end, right? It leads her to that, right?
Did your cat follow
it went a long way. That conversation went a long way. And about 3 minutes, we got there very quickly.
Very interesting.
Oh my goodness.
Well, was it Flannery O'Connor who said that we write stories because sentences are insufficient?
I don't know, but it's nice
to explain. I'm a little bit paraphrasing, but
Did Tanya write that?
No, but it's very nice.
No, that is a quote from her. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but basically the idea being that there are things about the human experience that can't really be summed up in just a couple of short sentences or propositions, that they have to be seen through in the medium of a story.
And I would just add that, going back to the Augustine point that you made, if it is about the things we love or like, then stories give us characters that we are compelled by. Their actions aren't just articulated. They're like, I love Aslan. I just want to be like Aslan. And that's a part of the power of story. We've talked a lot about virtue. We've gone into Aristotle, Plato. What have we left anything on the table? I think we've really covered a lot. I think that's just about it. There's so much that you can say. Well, thank you guys for having this conversation. I've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below, and if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.